Welcome to the DivG Webinar series launched in 2014 by the AERA Graduate Student Executive Committee. These former podcasts, now webinars, highlight scholarship, discuss contemporary issues, and hopefully start discussions among DivG members in the greater educational community. For an archive of last year's webinars, please visit the AERA DivG YouTube channel. Also, be sure to join our Facebook group, AERA DivG Students, Social Context of Education, and follow us on Twitter at AERA DivG. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're happy to be your host today. My name is Jamilia Harris, and I'm a third-year PhD student at UCLA.
Hello, my name is Renata Love Jones, and I am a fifth-year PhD candidate at Boston College.
We're excited to welcome Dr. Venus Evan Winters from Illinois State University, Dr. Subini Annamma from University of Kansas, and Brenda Rodriguez from the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network for a discussion on youth, power, and safety. We're going to begin by asking our guests a few questions and then open it up to the audience for questions. If you have any question, please feel free to type it into the Zoom chat box and click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen to open it up. So I'd like to welcome each of our participating scholars and just ask that everyone introduce themselves and tell us who you are and what brought you to this work. So we can start with Dr. Evans Winters.
Hi, my name is Dr. Evans Winters, again, Venus or Dr. V. I am an associate professor of education at Illinois State University, teaching educational policy analysis, educational research, or qualitative inquiry, as well as social foundations of education. I'm also a psychotherapist in private practice, serving majority minority communities with a specialization in racialized trauma, as well as sexual violence and abuse. How did I come to this work? A lot of this work I came to through working with youth and communities, and I stayed in this work because I like to hear young people's side of the story. And so I began to realize very early on in my career how young people especially was being basically violated or traumatized over and over again from some of our systematic or systems of violence. And so they had no voice and no platform in the struggle. So it became a part of my job as a healer to provide space for space making. And thank you, Jamilia, for getting all these wonderful women together in one place at one time. You were a space maker.
I'm Subini Annamma. I work at the University of Kansas, as you said. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Special Education. So before I became a professor, I was a special ed teacher for many years in public schools and in youth prisons. And I started realizing the connection between disability, race, and criminalization really early on in my teaching career. One of my first student teaching assignments was in a residential treatment center. And then when I was working in a large public high school, a lot of times kids would disappear for a couple days and say, oh, miss, I was in juvie, or miss, can you call my probation officer, or miss, somebody else is threatening to call my probation officer. And so really early on, really started seeing these connections between race, disability labeling, and criminalization. And it was really concerning to me. And so one of the things I wanted to do, even as a teacher, was know where my kids were going. So for my last couple of years of teaching, I actually went and taught in a maximum security youth prison. So I did that for a few years, and then I came out and decided to go back and get my doctorate. And when I was thinking about what to get it in, it was really about staying in special education and really having a conversation around disability and race, because that conversation wasn't being had in either my undergraduate or my master's, both which were in special ed. I don't even recall vaguely a conversation around overrepresentation of kids of color in special ed, let alone how we funnel them into the school prison nexus. So that was how I came to the work. beyond right now, I'm beyond professing and being a professor, living the professor life. I also am a yoga teacher. I teach a Black, Indigenous, and people of color healing space, and for healing from racism specifically and other intersectional marginalizations. I also am teaching in a girls' prison. I teach a socio-critical literacy class in a girls' prison. So I try to consistently center youth in all of my work, even in teacher ed and special ed, because I think most education reform and most education focuses on the adults, right? And actually, you know, kids are really honest, and they're not this idea that kids just lie and lie to get out of things. Like, not if you have a relationship with them. They're usually pretty honest, and they know when they're screwing up, and they know what they need in order to fix it. And usually what they need is a more critical framing of the world and support and understanding a critical analysis that they naturally have, but then supporting them in articulating that. And then they need adults to listen to them to actually meet their needs.
My name is Brenda Rodriguez. I am an undocumented community organizer in Eastern Washington. And you know, my story is very much like the story of many immigrants that come to this country. I was born in Mexico City, and I grew up in Veracruz, which is in the coast by the Gulf of Mexico. My parents had migrated to the United States to work, and they would send money to us back home. I am the oldest of three. And at the age of 9, I made the decision that I wanted to be with my parents, that I wanted to reunite. So I took on this journey and, you know, crossed the border without documents. And that was a decision that completely changed my life. I grew up in a small little town, a rural town in Eastern Washington. My parents are undocumented as well. They work in the fields, and growing up, it was an interesting experience because the town the majority was Latinx, predominantly Mexican, but we were the minority in positions of power. And I grew up very ashamed and embarrassed of who I was and where I came from. And I remember lying all the time about where I was born. I would say that I was born at the hospital where all my friends were born. And, you know, I avoided that conversation as much as possible. So I felt like if I said my story, I didn't feel like I was voiceless, but I felt like no one was going to hear, what I had to say. So as I was preparing to go to college and, you know, overcoming all these barriers to get to a university, when I finally made it, I found a group of undocumented students at Washington State University who were organizing, and they were saying they were undocumented and unafraid. And that was the very first time that I heard that phrase, and something just clicked. And I was like, I want to be with them. I felt so empowered hearing their stories. I felt like someone would listen to what I had to say. And that was the moment that I started organizing on campus with Crimson Group. We were fighting for the DREAM Act. We were fighting to deportations in our communities. And as I finished my undergrad, my original goal was to go to graduate school, get a PhD, and become a professor. But once I started working, organizing, I realized that the path that I wanted to pursue first was going to be working in communities and ensuring that our communities had the tools to fight back. So now I am the statewide coordinator for this network that has a hotline where people can call and report if ICE, Immigration Customs and Enforcement, is raiding their community, if somebody they love, one of their family members, their friends, has already been detained, or if someone is picked up at court, since that is the way that immigration is working in our state. So I have been doing this work for now going on 4 years, and I continue to do it because it directly impacts my life. It impacts my family's life. And this summer, the little town where I grew up was raided by Immigration, Customs and Enforcement, and a lot of the parents of the students that I went to school with were taken. So this literally hit home, and that was the moment that I realized how impactful this work was, and how much is needed in Eastern Washington, in a place where there's a lack of resources, where people work in the fields, where the owners are Trump supporters, but yet profit off the labor of our community.
Wow, thank you all. I just want to really thank you all for being here. And I want to give a shout out to Jamila, who was really a visionary for bringing this together, and Carolina Silva, who helped also to bring this together. But these are really powerful things that you guys are talking about. So you've all talked about what brought you to this work. Can you discuss a little bit more about why the work that you do is necessary? And anybody can jump in.
I mean, I just want to acknowledge the other two brilliant speakers that we just had, Brenda and Venus. Like, y'all are making clear why your work is necessary just by simply being in this space and sharing what you do. So I just want to acknowledge that. I also do want to say thank you to Jamelia and all of you for the organization that has brought us here. But man, that story, Brenda, of you saying that this affects your own life and your family's life. Like, I think that's such an important thing that we need to name, that so many multiply marginalized people of color do this work because it is directly related to our own life. I mean, I focus on girls of color because of the things that I didn't get in education growing up. I'm very clear that I am not the typical PhD student who was super successful in school and loves school and was so, I had a terrible schooling experience, and I write about it in my book just because I want to set the stage for people understanding that you don't have to have this perfect trajectory to get here. But I think so many of us are doing the work to heal our own selves as well as healing our communities, and understanding that it's a reciprocal relationship. I never want people to look at me and say, oh, you're so great because you do this work. Now, girl, I'm helping myself as much as and helping my community is helping myself. So I always want to like name that and push away from that savior complex that we tend to get when we hear we work with multiply marginalized people. So I just wanted to add that because, Brenda, that was just really important that you named that. And I just feel like both of you, you and Venus, continually talk about the importance of your work in healing yourself as well as healing your community. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. So I briefly touched on, why do I do what I do? Particularly in Washington State, the way that Immigration, Customs and Enforcement has been operating and deporting our community is by collaborating with local enforcements. So I live in a very conservative area. I live in a very, like it is Trump's territory, and we are criminalized just by the color of our skin. We are dehumanized. Even some allies that are in this work that are trying to do something for the immigrant community, oftentimes the way they talk about our experiences is very dehumanizing, and the way that they want to help a certain group of folks. They go into this binary between the good and the bad immigrant. Like, I want to help the students. I want to help the DACA recipients. I want to help the dreamers. But that is completely excluding our parents, the people that are doing the work, that are oftentimes more at risk of being detained. So in today's political climate, it's no secret that families have been separated for decades. Democrats deport, Republicans deport. But particularly in this area where I live, we have seen an increase of collaboration between local enforcement and Immigration, Customs and Enforcement. So a lot of the work that I do is educational. I go into communities. I go into migrant programs. I pull over and you know, when people are working on the fields, and I do like a brief know your rights presentations. We do what we call rapid response, which is working with community members, empowering them to take action. And once they take action, if a family in that particular area is going through the complicated immigration system, they are there to provide support. They are there to connect them with local resources. So this work is necessary because I can't do it alone. I can't be in every city, in every town of our community. And, you know, like I mentioned briefly before, we oftentimes hear this narrative, or people say, oh, I want to be the voice for those that are voiceless. But that's not the case for me. Like, I want to make sure that we have the tools so we can speak for ourselves and we can fight back. So the work that I do is necessary because we need to know how to fight back. We need to know what our rights are. We need to know that we are not alone. We need to know that there's an entire network that's supporting and has resources to fight deportations. And, you know, it's a really scary time for a lot of us. And by sharing my story, by being as vocal as I am about my work, it puts a target on my back and oftentimes puts my family at risk. And that is something that I'm learning how to navigate and how to cope with, because that is very scary to know that I'm here to fight for myself and for my family, but with that comes the burden that I might be putting them at risk. So it's a very complicated situation to be in. But it has been also amazing to see what this administration has done in terms of calling people to action. So many people who didn't want to be involved, didn't think that they had the power to change policy, to change the living conditions of our communities, are now taking action. So it's definitely, I have learned that activism, organizing is a journey, it's a lifetime commitment, is a journey of growth, of healing, and I hope to continue doing it for a long time.
So I'm sitting here and I'm trying to be contemplative and think through, because I don't want to like answer too quickly, like, why do you do this work, right? And I think sometimes we have an easy answer, but unfortunately, I don't have the privilege of separating my identities. It's something that I embody. It's you all met, even my 13-year-old daughter at the start of the video. Just to wake up and to boldly raise a child in this climate is a form of resistance. And to still raise a child unapologetically in the spirit of culture, as a cultural project and as a political project. And so even thinking about why do I do what I do, I remember waking up this morning and thinking of the irony, right? To Subini's point, the irony in being and grappling with my own anger, and yet I'm a therapist and a mindfulness meditation teacher. And so I do want to, so it would be too convoluted in this space, right? We can have a whole retreat, a week, 2 week retreat to talk about why this work. So I want to try to narrow it. And I use that word intentionally, narrow it, for the purpose of AERA Division G. So let's talk about research. Let's talk about policy practice in the context of AERA and the work that we do. I do this work because when I first entered this space, and it's been a while now, but when I first entered this space, especially in undergraduate studies, I remember learning about psychology, and I remember thinking all of psychology focuses on the pathology of Black people and women. And it was being told from the perspective of dead white men, telling us what's wrong with us. Women are neurotic and Black people are just inherently pathological. Then when I started to study sociology, I loved sociology. I loved how it thought about people in context of institutions and systems. But this story was being told by white men who very rarely actually talked to or lived within communities of color. And so it was basically asking or requiring us to adapt to these institutions. Or this conversation was taking place from a white feminist perspective. And so all the women were white. And so I took it upon myself to start studying the civil rights movement and women in the movement. I mean, of course, you had people like Rosa Parks, right? But they were always talked about as an assistance to Black men. So I went about it myself to study what were women's stories. And one thing I learned, and this is my soapbox of late with academia, but we are all here doing something differently, interestingly enough. When I studied Black women's role in the civil rights movement, what I found out is that I discovered that a lot of those women connected their knowledge and their theory building to an actual skill set. Now, movement work is skill work, but how does that look? We don't talk about that in our PhD programs. We don't talk about that in our theoretical frameworks. But movement work looked like someone actually being a credentialed teacher. So having the skill of pedagogy and building curriculum on behalf of Black children and other marginalized groups. It also looked like specializing in the nursing field. So our foremothers understood that in order to combat white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, we had to be able to heal our communities, and not from a pathological perspective or a perspective of illness, but from the perspective of spiritual and cultural health and wealth. Could you imagine that? So a part of movement work, women became nurses. Absolutely amazing. So you're talking about community work, but you also had people who became social workers. So the job was to go out into our communities and actually teach, mostly women at this time, and immigrants, depending on where you live, how to take care of themselves and their family. So it was this transferring of skills. And what I noticed is as I started to pursue further and further the doctorate and go into doctoral studies, we were moving further away from community. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, Bell Hooks in particular talks about we shouldn't have to choose between movement work and theory work. They're both work, just different types of labor. So I'm not suggesting that. But to answer the question, why this work? Because there's too many methodologies, too many theoretical frameworks, too many policy analysis and perspectives that can only look at Black and brown people from a deficit perspective or from starting with analysis of pathology. What do we need to do to fix them? I remember I was in Chicago at a conference that was a lot of community members, and this sister stood up, and it took a mother to say this. She said, I'm tired of coming to y'all conferences and listening to white people put before us fix a nigga projects. And I was like, you know, it was like a faux pas. It was a faux pas, but I thought she's right. Everything we do, some of us, we've been socialized into academia to think we have to fix our people. Our people are the problem. Think about how we frame our research questions. The research problem I'm studying, to understand this problem. So basically, communities of color, in particular, in my case, Black girls and Black women, or multiracial girls and multiracial women, you asking us to adopt a broken system, adapt to, and to fit in, and to pathology. The system itself is broken. So why this work? Because we need some truth tellers. What happens when I wake up angry as a therapist and a mindful meditation teacher, and I can embrace my anger to use it for change and to say, I'm not going to cope. I'm not going to adapt to a fucked up pathological system. That's why I do this work.
Venus, I just want to add, I'm really glad you're naming it as like pathological system, because the name of my book, everyone's giving me crap for the name of the book because it's so long, because it's the pedagogy of pathologization, because that was what I found in public schools and youth prisons when we're working with girls of color, right? And multiply marginalized kids of color. And when we talk about why that work is important, you know, I argue that prisons are where, you know, Angela Davis says, Angela Davis reminds us that prisons are where we deposit our most vulnerable. And so most of my girls were not only disabled, not only were they of color, they were queer, they were gender nonconforming. I had undocumented girls. So like, again, if you want to see, when we talk about the social context of who we send to prisons, right? Especially youth prisons, because youth prisons are like a microcosm of the struggle. Right. And so they are exactly, that's what they do in those places, right? Is that, you know, there's,
and now too, Subini, right now, to even interrupt you, because where you're going is very, very important. Now we don't even have to call them prisons.
Exactly.
We don't even have to call them youth detention centers. 20 years ago, that was the words, but now they're using terminology and discourse that makes it appears as if these kids are not incarcerated when mentally and physically they are, right?
In LA County, they're called camps. That's the youth camps. They're camps. They're camps. They're fun. But when you go into them and the girls can't touch their hair, that's in different prisons I've gone to, where girls literally have to get permission to touch their hair and are constantly being told that any gender expression is at the will of the institution, right? We end up in these places, right? And what I think what else you're touching on, Venus, is really important is that the carceral reach of Prison Nation has begun to reach into our homes, right? So one of the things that we're doing in this fun language around reducing the incarceration population and reducing youth prisons have been great, but what's happened is we haven't stopped criminalizing. So kids of color, what's happening to a lot of them is that they are getting ankle bracelets, right? So they get ankle bracelets and they have to stay in their house. But here's the thing, if they cut off their ankle bracelet, guess what? In Kansas, it's a felony. So then they're felons. So we have actually tightened the carceral hold on them instead of loosened it, with our commitment to rushing out of incarceration but yet still refusing to let up our commitment to criminalization.
From a developmental perspective, when we're looking at trajectories, I know, and I'm sure Subini knows, right? Brenda, you know, our carceral state is beginning, the criminalization, the pathway to criminalization is beginning as early as the womb. I work with clients who babies are snatched in the delivery room. Can you imagine? And so if you want to know why I can go to bed, hopefully I don't go to bed angry, thank God for meditation, I'm becoming better at it. But I wake up angry because I have to deal with the long-term effects, not only of the mother, the birth mother, but also of the child. We now know enough about neurology and the development of the brain and the body trauma, right? The body keeps the score. We know enough now that we are allowing the state to leave its imprint on our children as early as the womb. So yes, she's stressed, right? How many mothers I have here? I'm a mother twice over, but we're allowing them to leave that stress before the infant, before the child is even born. And now imagine, you're talking about 12 years a slave, let's say 22 years a slave. We're snatching these babies out of the delivery room. The trauma to the mother, but the trauma to the child. Imagine. And these are going to be young people and young mothers, and also the fathers are affected too, who are going to enter into our classrooms and our school buildings. And I would love to hear Brenda's perspective, because over the last 6 months, even what we're seeing at the border, or even this patrolling way outside the border, has implications for child development and also maternal and paternal connections to their developing child.
You know, just 3 weeks ago, we received a call to the hotline about a family of 13 that came from El Salvador. Once they got to the border, they were all separated in different camps across the country. And they had a child with them. The child was separated from the mom and she was being held in Texas. One of the camps that was built during this administration. And, 11 of them were able to be released. They're in the seeking asylum process. They were sent to Washington State. They didn't know anybody. And then the other 2 people, the child, a 9-year-old little girl, and her cousin were still in Texas. So after, they were granted bond, we found the resources to pay for a bond. But when this child was reunited with her family, she didn't even recognize her own family. She got off of the plane. As she's walking, all her family is there. And she was so frightened. She was so frightened to even be touched by her own family. And this is something that we have seen over and over and over again. Usually the younger the child is, the less likely that they are to recognize their mom. And you see the mothers that are sobbing and, they're like, you are my child. And the child is just, it's almost like if the child's not there. So this is creating, those are the kids that are reunited with their families now, but there are thousands that are still being caged, literally caged, that all they get is a foil blanket, that are being kept, in cages, and they sleep on the floor, they can't play, they can't talk. In one of the camps, there's a huge mural of Trump. That is all they have to look at. So as a child, that I myself came to this country when I was 9 years old, and I went through the traumatic experience of, crossing the border for a week without water, without food, and even coming and reuniting with my parents after not seeing them for over 6 years. I even remember that numbness, that when I first thought about coming, I was excited because I was going to see my parents. But when I actually got here after going through that traumatic experience, I felt numb when I saw my parents. And I remember hugging them. Well, they hugged me, and I was just standing there like, this is not what I thought it would be like. I thought it was gonna be more exciting, but I was still processing everything that had happened to me. And it's something, that I don't think I have even processed fully yet. And as I do this work, it's something that just comes up again and again, because I saw this little 9-year-old girl, like, having the same reaction that I had 15 years ago when I came to this country. And, it just even triggers my own trauma, but I can't even imagine the trauma that the children that are still in the detention centers are going to have for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, Brenda, we, in many ways, I want to, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. I think in many ways that I want to apologize. I feel like those of us who have access to the resources, and when I mean resources, I mean white people who have some kind of power. That can be pen power, it can be money. But many of us were duped and co-opted when we entered the academy. We bought into serving white people's agenda, meaning that we became so focused on the problems of white folk that we forgot to look out for the least of them. Before, when we were pursuing these degrees and these doctorates, and we wanted to have access to libraries and places to disseminate our work, the goal was that we will look out for our own. But what I've noticed in the last decade, you have a lot of people who are chasing credentials, status, and fake or false prestige. And so now, just like we all know here, if you are of African ancestry and Latino descent, the one thing we know for sure is that they recruiting hard, for example, in our neighborhoods, nurses, nurses, people into the medical field. They're not doing it because they want us to become top nurses, at our local hospitals. They're not doing it because they really want us to become physicians or doctors. They're doing it because white people are getting older. The elderly white folks are the fastest growing population right now in the United States outside of the Latino community, which is a younger group. They're going to be more voting age, under the age of 18 as well. What's happening is we don't even know how to go back out and help our people. Like, some of us just don't have the courage. We sit before even our graduate students who are thinking about research questions, and I'm like, what does this have to do with our people? What does this have to do about your grandma who has diabetes? What does this have to do about your mama who's struggling with hypertension, or your brother who has been misdiagnosed or undiagnosed with a disability? What does this have to do with your cousin who locked up now facing 18 years in prison? See, we forget. So we forget what questions to ask. And that's part of the problem, is that we are losing the focus. Why these degrees and what's the purpose of research? And I'm not saying everybody is going to agree with me, but what I am saying is I do think we could do a better job, some of us, of just supporting our communities. We forget why we chose this path. So thank you.
Thank you all so much for just preaching and serving and giving me my life this morning. I truly appreciate you for sharing your stories and just your knowledge and valuable insights. So I want to just kind of redirect the conversation, and well, not really redirect, but I think we all sort of touched on the current political climate and how that informs the work that we're doing. But I want us to think specifically about the Federal Commission's recommendation to rescind Obama-era guidance intended to reduce racial discrimination in school discipline, and particularly DivG's urging for a holistic view of school safety, in which schools seriously consider partnering with local law enforcement and training and arming school personnel, despite so many youth who've been marching around gun control and who have vocalized feeling unsafe with armed police officers in their school campuses, and sort of frame this, use this political context to frame the question around in what ways you see using youth voice for advancing policy practice and programming changes to promote school safety. And anyone can jump in.
I mean, so I can talk a little bit about, from my work, right, is I work, as I've said before, in youth prisons and public schools. And the last big research project we did was with 50 girls of color in a public school, talking about their experiences with disciplinary disparities. So these are girls, some who have been disciplined and some who haven't. Some were just girls who observed other people being disciplined. And what they continually tell us is that these disciplinary issues begin in the classroom, and they actually often begin with academic issues. That is, girls raising their hand and not getting called on. Girls doing what they're supposed to be doing, girls of color doing what they're supposed to be doing, and not getting the positive behavioral supports that everybody says is going to get rid of discipline disparities. All of these different ways that girls are being disenfranchised, or what we're using the term debilitated, which is this process of foreclosure of access to knowledge, even when they're in the public school classroom with everyone else. So this idea that we're going to ever be able to bring law enforcement in who've had often have very little training to none of working with children, who have had very little training to none of understanding racial issues from any kind of a critical framework, is really just frightening to me. That this is the answer. It's predictable. Let me be very clear. It's predictable and yet still terrifying for our children. because we know girls of color, and Black girls in particular, but many girls of color, are not going to be protected by femininity. And in fact, because they're positioned against white female teachers, a lot of the times white female teachers are using their femininity to point out how unfeminine our girls are, and therefore that they need to be more subjected to punishment. So, I mean, we all know that, right? The argument that they were making, right? I have, in one of my articles recently, I have a quote from Jeff Sessions where he's talking about discipline and why we need to have better discipline in schools. And there's this constant implication of who is it that needs to be disciplined, which bodies, which minds, which behaviors. And it is almost always Black and brown children that we are referring to as who needs to be disciplined, who needs to be, so the idea that we could ever bring in law enforcement and there would be increased safety when we continually see law enforcement, excuse me, I have a little bit of a cold, exacerbating the issues that are already happening in neighborhoods, let alone in schools. Just as, to me, it's antithetical to every iota of research that we have. But there, and youth are usually telling us that that's not what they need or want. Youth are telling us, I mean, the kids who are out with the LA Teachers Union were saying the same things. They know they need counselors. They know they need nurses. They know they need so much. And what's complicated is they, at that point, can't even hold their teachers accountable because the teachers are fighting for them, right, in this particular situation. But the teachers, we need better training for our teachers, and that falls squarely on the shoulders of us in teacher education to be providing those critical lenses, right? And though I think many of us do that work, there's a lot that don't. Or we're the only ones in our program that talk about race, or we're the only ones who talk about intersectionality and understanding multiple marginalizations at the same time. So for me, it's just, it tells you how far removed the people who are making decisions, including Betsy DeVos and Jeff Sessions, I know he's gone now, but, and those folks are, from actually caring about youth and youth voice. And in fact, I think they've committed to white supremacy and cis heteropatriarchy, ableism in ways, and xenophobia in ways that make our kids the targets of the removal. They're very comfortable with saying that our kids need to be removed. I don't even think it's dog whistle anymore. Like, I think we're past dog whistle. Like, dog whistle is the idea that, you know, it's underlying racial implications, but so much of this is not even underlying anymore. I mean, the rhetoric coming out of 45's administration is not dog whistle. That is straight up xenophobia. It is straight up racism. It's straight up ableism. It is straight up cis heteropatriarchy. It is attacking trans folks. You know, it's all the people at the intersections. We see that with the attack on Nathan Phillips and our Indigenous elder. We just seen it over and over again. So yeah, I just don't trust any of those folks to make decisions for our kids. And I don't think that most of our kids don't either.
This is, Jamila, one of those conversations that's really difficult to have. And I think this is an example of how education has failed me. Because when we talk school policy, especially discipline and detention and racial inequality, I have to rely on the master's tongue. Some of my discourse is different than if I was having this conversation in community, sitting around the table, you know, or on my grandma's front porch, right? So if I get too esoteric in my conversation, then people should just ask me a question, you know, to you in the chat. So I'm gonna try to explain this. And this is the conversation that I would say took me, as some of you all know, to the White House under President Obama's administration to discuss research on girls and women. So when I was invited there. But it's also the same conversation, I think, that took me to the United States of Women in 2018 in LA to, you know, present on the same stage as Michelle Obama and some other justice workers, youth activists, and organizers. But this is also the conversation that gets me in trouble at school boards meetings or when we're doing organizing work. Okay, so they're all aligned, but how we have this conversation from a policy and research perspective is a little different. So shutting shit down on Michigan Avenue might be different from me shutting shit down, you know, at a school board meeting, so to speak. So with that said, okay, so really I want to, I'm going to say in this case with this conversation, Black girls and other girls of color, but looking at the disciplinary records, because Black girls have had an increase of almost 300 times the trend just 3 to 5 years ago as far as school discipline. So when we're talking about school discipline and Every Student Succeed Act, really, it's one, zero tolerance policy, which comes right out of, you know, that's drug talk. You know, that's so-called drug reform talk, you know, zero tolerance as it relates to the war on drugs and, you know, which in the war on poverty, which really means the war on Black and brown bodies in our urban epicenter. So let's be clear. Discourse can be weaponry. It's a form of necropolitics. Okay, so it's the obsession of using policy and biowarfare to justify the killing of the other and the proliferation of visions of the killing of the other. So think about recently in popular media and pop culture, how we seeing Black girls' bodies being basically maimed and beaten, right? And being humiliated. So we've seen dragons, literally, draggings of Black girls' bodies by white police officers in our schools. We've seen white vigilantes, you know, kill Black women and beat Black girls before our eyes, to the fact that we become numb to it. It's just a part of the status quo. I'm not gonna say we don't feel, but most of us here on this line have been traumatized. So most of us have learned to cope by numbing ourselves, calming ourselves, right? So some of this is just some of this is warfare at its finest. Let's be clear. So when you talk about rolling back Obama's policies, it's intentional and it's strategic. But from a policy, so that's the norm. That's the norm in the US, in America, okay, America. So now that we talk about it from a policy perspective though, it's difficult to have that conversation because yes, ESSA, or that Obama policy, was a good policy in the sense that it said we needed to look out for the social, emotional, and educational needs of particular subcategories. Those subcategories, as outlined, right, by Every Student Succeed Act, and in state of Illinois, it's called SB 100. Okay, so the student bill, so not to suspend, et cetera, or to at least look for alternative discipline options before suspending or expelling the student. So listed in those subcategories were boys, mostly boys of colors, Black boys were particularly named, poor students or students from low income families, ESL and ELL students, and students with an identified disability or students with a disability. So who was left? Who did not get named? See, this is the problem when we start looking at school discipline from a gender perspective and a race-based perspective. So who's still falling through the cracks? The one group that was actually the most offended by zero tolerance policy schools outside of Black boys, which is Black girls. So yeah, we still weren't really protected by this policy. So those of us who do critical race feminism, it actually puts us in, once again, it puts us in a bind. Because of course we want to advocate for these particular subcategory of students, but where does that leave Black girls? Black girls can be all of these. They can have an identified or non-identified disability. They can fall under the category of ESL or ELL. They can come from low-income families, right? And they're part of a racial ethnic minority group. But no one thought about the unique needs or the intersectional needs of Black girls. So even our research and our policies aren't intersectional, so Black girls are always falling through the crack. And so with that knowledge, right, Black girls aren't protected in school, because I can easily say, well, she's not a boy, not to mention just opposed to whiteness. So now we got this spectrum of gender and, you know, feminine, masculine, binaries, which is a whole nother story, because majority of these girls who are getting suspended or expelled from school, they actually they're non-gender conforming, or they may identify with the LGBTQ community. So that's another issue. Most of them, as Vina has pointed out, they also may have a disability, and that's a very subjective disability. So we're deciding who's even going to benefit from disability law and policy. So think about that from a discipline perspective, or from this social emotional perspective, or now everybody's on the trauma bandwagon and nobody's qualified in our schools to talk about trauma. So some of these policies need to be targeting these teachers. Who's to say they're the most healthy? So their whiteness card and their femininity card give them a pass as healthy? That doesn't make sense. So I think from a policy perspective, no, we don't want to roll back that policy, but we also need to revisit that policy from an intersectional perspective. And we explicitly need to have a category for Black girls and for girls of color, period. They need to have they should be a protective class in our schools. So that's one thing. The other thing is all of us here should be calling for a moratorium on school expulsions. Our school system, we know our schools aren't functioning where they should be functioning, majority of our schools right now. We also know more about, white supremacy, patriarchy, imperialism, but we also know about the effects of poverty as a traumatic experience imposed by unchecked capitalism. So how can we trust the people who are making the decisions as far as school discipline to push our kids out? And so when we're talking about girls of color, in particular, my research looks at Black girls and other girls of color, non-gender conforming students. Think about it like this. What are we sending them home to, right? So recent research came out that there's a lot of Americans over a certain age. I can't remember the age cutoff, like 55 plus or something to that extent. But there's a lot of people in the US and Europe who are reaching that elderly population where isolation is starting to affect their mental health. But yet in our schools, we're seeing more and more kids being suspended and expelled. So basically we're teaching our children to adapt to social exclusion. When we know more women of color, especially Black women, are reporting feeling isolated and feeling alone, it's counterintuitive. So again, it's that intersectional perspective that's missing. So we need that moratorium. We need to stop this outside of school suspensions or exclusionary disciplinary policy. Now that's a bold move, because many of us, we thinking of extremes. But I don't know about you all, but I've watched TV, and the last time I've watched television, I've never seen a Black girl shoot up a school. Never, right? So how is she becoming the target of these policies, these Negro politics? So that's a whole nother thing. So our Black girls, and I don't want to dominate this conversation, I go on and on, but yes, we need a moratorium on school expulsions, meaning just put an end to them until we can end apartheid schooling, until we can end basically the racism, white supremacy in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our schools, in our economic system. We cannot rely on these schools to discipline and punish our children.
I just want to speak for everybody else. Like, people are glued to their seats right now. We definitely are running out of time, but this conversation, yeah, I have no words other than to say that, like, no words. Yeah, this is really, really powerful. This work it needs to be talked about in every space, and I'm going to be sharing this video widely. Thank you all. I want to let Jamila do the closing. I'm sorry to everyone who had really beautiful and powerful questions. Make sure if you get to come to AERA this year that you come and join Division G, but I'm gonna hand it over to Jamila.
I just want to say thank you so much, so much, Dr. Evan Winters, Dr. Subini, Annamma, and Brenda Rodriguez for contributing your powerful voices. I am just beyond moved by you three incredible women, and honestly, this is more than I could have ever imagined. This is my first time ever hosting a webinar with AERA Division G, and so I'm just really grateful for you all for committing your knowledge, your insights, your labor of love to pushing this work forward, and really just beyond in awe by all of your incredible words and actions that you all are putting into this meaningful work. And so with that being said, again, I want to thank you all for joining us and for engaging in the conversation to explore ways to expand youth voice in the Academy and beyond. And we invite you to continue examining these questions with us on Twitter using #DivisionGChat and following us at AERA Division G. We also encourage you to visit our Division G blog to learn more about our upcoming webinars and opportunities, aeradivisiong.wordpress.com. And finally, to all of our Division G graduate students, remember that you are eligible to apply to our Division G travel grant, and you can find out more information about that on our website as well. So we look forward to hearing your ideas and insights and to your participation in our next webinar. Thank you again, everyone, and have a wonderful day.